The night they tried to raid my land was the night they finally learned who they were dealing with. I remember it like it happened yesterday. The crickets were singing, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, and my porch light flickered like it always did when a storm was close. My wife, Dana, was inside wrapping a few boxes, things we'd packed for the small farmers market we ran every weekend. Life was simple, quiet, peaceful at least it used to be. Until the HOA decided my land that had been in my family for 3 generations, didn't fit their vision. That's how they worded it in the first letter. A letter so polished, so polite, you could almost miss the poison inside. They said my barn-turned-workshop was an unapproved structure, that my fencing didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic that my grandfather's flagpole, the same one that flew his service flag from World War II, violated height restrictions. Flagpole was more than a pole. It was a promise, a piece of him still standing tall, reminding me why we fought for this land. So when the HOA president, a man named Bradley Cole, who wore more cologne than conscience, told me I had 30 days to comply, I smiled, nodded, and quietly swore that I wouldn't budge an inch. I tried being reasonable. I showed them my deed, the one dating back before their subdivision even existed. I explained that my property was grandfathered in, not subject to their new rules. But they didn't care, because this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Bradley didn't like that my house sat on the corner. The first thing people saw, driving into his perfect community, he didn't. Like that, my workshop, where I rebuilt old tractors and Mustangs with my son, wasn't some cookie cutter. Garage painted approved beige. And deep down, I think he just couldn't stand a man who wouldn't bow, so for weeks, the letters kept coming. Fines, warnings, threats. Then one night, October 14th, 10 p.m. sharp, I heard engines rolling up my gravel drive. Headlights pierced through the dark. Dana peered through the curtains. "Honey, is that?" It was 2 police cruisers, lights flashing, and behind them, a pair of SUVs. Black, shiny, spotless. HOA vehicles. My heart started pounding. I stepped outside, barefoot, still holding the wrench I'd been working with. "Mr. Lawson?" One of the officers called out. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice calm. "We have a complaint filed by your HOA. Said there's illegal activity on the premises. We're here to investigate legal activity." At 10 p.m., on my own land, I looked past the officers and saw Bradley smirking from his car, arms folded. Beside him, his right-hand woman, Karen, the self-appointed compliance officer. She was already filming on her phone. "This is outrageous," Dana whispered, clutching my arm. "You told them I did," I said quietly. "I told them everything. This wasn't about truth. This was about public humiliation. They wanted a show. They wanted me to lose my temper. They wanted me arrested so they could say, 'See? He's dangerous. He doesn't belong here.'" So I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. "Officers," I said, "you're welcome to look around. I've got nothing to hide. But I'll be recording everything. And before you enter that workshop, you should know this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction." One of the officers raised a brow. "Sir, we just need to check the report. They said you're operating an unlicensed repair business." That's when I realized Bradley had escalated. He hadn't just filed a complaint, he'd lied to the police. A chill ran through me. Dana gasped. "They can't just—" "I know," I said softly. "But let them look. We've got truth on our side." So they did. They searched the workshop, saw the old Ford Mustang I'd been restoring with my boy. They saw the shelves of tools, the piles of scrap, the framed pictures of my dad and granddad on the wall. They saw a man's life, not a business. After 10 minutes, one of the officers came back out, shaking his head. "There's nothing illegal here," he said to Bradley. But Bradley wouldn't let up. He marched forward, waving a clipboard. "We have bylaws. This man's in violation. He's running a business on residential land." "Actually," I said, stepping closer, "this is agricultural land. Zoned differently. My family owned it before your subdivision ever existed. And these I pulled out a folder from inside the house are the county records to prove it. I held them up, right under the porch light. The seal glimmered. The dates were clear. 1952, decades before the HOA's incorporation. Bradley's smirk faded. For the first time, he looked uncertain, but Karen stepped forward, voice sharp as a knife. Then why don't you move? You don't belong in our community. We're building something better? Better? I snapped, my patience finally cracking. You mean fake? Controlled? Soulless? You think repainting mailboxes makes you civilized? You think bullying people like me makes you powerful? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Sir, one of them said finally, we're done here. Have a good night. He turned and left. But Bradley didn't. He stayed right there at the end of my driveway, staring at me like a man who'd just lost a battle, but hadn't given up the war. Then, under his breath, he said something that made my blood run cold. You'll regret this. When they finally drove off, Dana broke down crying. She wasn't scared of them. She was scared of what they'd do next. Because people like Bradley don't stop. They regroup. They scheme. They come back meaner. That night, after she went to bed, I sat on the porch, staring out at the fields my grandfather once plowed with his bare hands. This land wasn't just dirt. It was memory. Every fence post, every tree, every stone, it all carried pieces of the men who built our name. And I realized this wasn't about some HOA rulebook. It was about respect. About standing up for something real in a world obsessed with control. So I made a promise. Not to fight them with anger, not to stoop to their level, but to fight back legally using the very laws they thought they could twist. The next morning, I called an attorney, an old friend of my father's, who specialized in property and zoning law. When I told him what happened, he laughed, not because it was funny, but because he'd seen this movie before. They picked the wrong guy, he said. If your deed predates their charter, you've got them cornered. Let's get your paperwork ready. We'll make them eat their own bylaws. Over the next few days, I gathered everything, deeds, zoning maps, even old photos of my family working the fields before there were ever sidewalks or HOA meetings. And as I dug deeper, I found something shocking. The HOA's boundary line, the one they claimed included my property, wasn't even filed correctly. The county registrar's office confirmed it. Bradley's precious territory had a clerical error, a mistake that meant my land wasn't just independent. It was completely exempt from their authority. I felt a spark of pride, not arrogance, not revenge, just quiet justice, the kind my granddad would have smiled at. Still, I knew exposing them wouldn't be simple, because HOAs don't like losing face. And Bradley, he'd sooner burn the rule book than admit he was wrong. Sure enough, 2 days later, a fresh letter landed in my mailbox. This one wasn't polite. It was a notice of legal action. They were suing me, claiming breach of covenant and non-compliance with community standards. They wanted my workshop torn down, my flag removed, and fines paid in full. Dana looked at the letter, pale as snow. They can't do this, can they? They can try, I said. But they're about to learn what happens when you mess with a man who knows the law and the land. Because this wasn't just a battle over property anymore. It was a fight for legacy, for pride, for the right to stand on the ground my family earned and say, this is ours. So I called my lawyer, told him everything, and we got to work. If they wanted a war in court, they'd get one, but they'd regret ever lighting the fuse. The morning after the HOA filed their lawsuit, I stood at my kitchen counter, staring at the envelope like it was a snake ready to strike. It wasn't just paper. It was a declaration, a line in the sand. They wanted me to bend, to break, pick up and leave the home my father built with his bare hands. But they didn't understand something about me. You can push a man. You can threaten him. But when you try to take his family's land, you wake something up inside him, and I was wide awake. Dana sat across from me, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. You're sure about this? she asked softly. It's not just money, it's stress. Lawyers, hearings. I nodded. I know. But if we let them win now, what's next? Our flag? Our garden? Our history? She looked down. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. Because she knew. This wasn't about ego. It was about respect for the people who came before us. By noon, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, a cozy wood-paneled room that smelled like old books and coffee. Across the desk sat Tom Reeves, gray hair, sharp eyes, and a reputation for taking down bullies in suits. He flipped through the HOA's lawsuit, shaking his head. Classic overreach, he muttered. They're citing covenants from a charter written decades after your property line was established.
He tapped the paper.
They're acting like they have authority over land they never legally acquired. That's not just arrogant, it's sloppy. I leaned forward. So we can beat this? Tom smiled. Oh, we're not just going to beat them. We're going to embarrass them legally, of course. We started digging. I spent days pulling old documents, maps, even aerial photos from the county archives. Every record told the same story. My land sat outside the HOA's jurisdiction, but there was more. When Tom compared the HOA's charter filings with the county zoning maps, he found something even more explosive. Bradley, the HOA president, had personally forged a boundary extension request years ago. It was never approved. But he'd been acting like it was collecting dues, issuing fines. Bullying homeowners on land he didn't control. It was fraud. Plain and simple. Tom looked up from the file, eyes wide. If we prove this, we won't just clear your name. We'll blow the lid off the entire HOA. But Bradley wasn't backing down either. 2 days later, a courier arrived with a thick packet, discovery documents. They were trying to bury me in paperwork, hoping I'd give up or miss something. But they underestimated one thing. I'm meticulous. Every night after dinner, I'd sit at the table with a stack of papers reading line by line. Dana would bring me coffee, sometimes just sit beside me, silent support in her eyes. And the deeper I dug, the clearer it became they had nothing solid. Just threats, half-truths, and fabricated violations. They claimed my workshop violated aesthetic harmony. One found county records, calling it a heritage structure. Predating the HOA, they claimed my fence was non-compliant. It turns out, the original fence posts were listed in historical survey documents. Every accusation I had a receipt. Every claim I had proof. They wanted a war. I was bringing facts to the battlefield. The first court hearing was held 3 weeks later, a chilly morning in November. I wore my father's old watch. It didn't even tick anymore, but it made me feel like he was there beside me, inside. Bradley sat with his attorney, a slick-looking man in a $1,000 suit and a smirk to match. Karen was there too, in the gallery, whispering behind her phone. The judge called the case, and we stepped forward. Bradley's lawyer started strong, painting me as a defiant homeowner, refusing to comply with community standards, used big words. He waved charts. He tried to make it sound like I was some reckless outsider threatening their neighborhood's peace. But when it was Tom's turn, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't use fancy jargon. He simply opened a folder, placed the original deed on the bench, and said, Your Honor, before this HOA even existed, this land belonged to the Lawson family. And here's the proof. County seals, survey dates, zoning records. My client's property was never and is not now under HOA jurisdiction. The courtroom went quiet. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipped through the documents, and looked at Bradley. Mr. Cole, do you have evidence to the contrary? Bradley's lawyer hesitated, then stammered, believe the HOA's revised charter. Revised by whom? Tom interrupted, because the county registrar has no record of an approved boundary revision. The judge's eyebrow shot up. Is that true? Bradley swallowed hard. His face turned red. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably. We may need additional time to verify. Take all the time you need, the judge said. But for now, I see no legal basis for your claims. Case continues under review. Bang, the gavel struck. We walked out that day not with victory, but with momentum. And that scared them. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Word had gotten out. Apparently, other homeowners had been fighting similar battles, bullied by the same HOA leadership. One woman approached me, tears in her eyes. They fined me $1,000 for painting my shutters blue, she said. Said it violated some rule I'd never even seen. Ah! Another man nodded. They told me to remove my shed. Said it wasn't approved. Turns out, they'd lost the form I submitted. Oh, I realized. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was our fight, and maybe, just maybe, standing up for my land could help others find their voice too. But Bradley wasn't done scheming. A few nights later, found a notice taped to my fence. It said I was being fined again, this time for damaging community property. I laughed out loud. Community property? It was my fence. Then I noticed the bottom of the letter, a forged signature from the county inspector. A signature I knew because the real inspector, George Miller, was my fishing buddy. I called him the next morning. George, you ever sign off on an HOA fine against me? He chuckled. What? No, I don't work with HOAs. Haven't in years. I snapped a picture and sent it to him. He went quiet, then said, That's not my signature. You better save that, it's forgery. Another nail in their coffin. Tom filed a counterclaim the next day, not just to dismiss their lawsuit, but to charge the HOA with fraud, harassment, and defamation. That's when things turned ugly. I started getting anonymous letters in the mailbox. Sell now or regret it. Drop the case. Your family doesn't belong here. Dana found one and nearly tore it in half. They're cowards, she spat. They're scared, I corrected her. That's what bullies do when they're losing. Still, I installed security cameras. I wasn't taking chances. As the second court date approached, the pressure mounted. But so did the evidence. Tom uncovered emails between Bradley and a local developer. Plans to acquire my property for a commercial expansion. That was the real motive all along. Bradley didn't care about fences or aesthetics. He wanted my land for profit. He wanted to bully me out so they could pave it over. And the best part? Those emails were dated months before the first violation letter, meaning the entire campaign against me was premeditated. When Tom showed me the printed emails, I just sat there in silence. All the pieces clicked into place. The fake reports, the forged documents, the lies. It wasn't random. It was planned. I clenched my fists, anger boiling beneath the surface. Not the hot, reckless kind, but the cold, focused kind. The kind that fuels justice. They picked the wrong man, I said quietly. Tom nodded. And now we make them answer for it. The second hearing was set for a Friday evening, fitting, since that was the same night they'd first tried to raid my land. This time, the courtroom was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even a few county officials. Word had spread. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was about corruption. Bradley looked different now, no more smug smile. Karen sat 2 rows behind him, arms folded tight, his eyes darting everywhere but mine. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Tom stood, calm as ever. Your Honor, he began, we've uncovered new evidence, emails, fraudulent documents, and a forged signature. This wasn't enforcement. It was extortion. He laid the evidence out, one piece at a time. Each page hit the table like a hammer blow. By the time he finished, you could hear a pin drop. The judge leaned back, staring at Bradley. Mr. Cole, do you have anything to say? Bradley's face was pale. His lawyer whispered frantically, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The judge sighed. We'll reconvene next week for a ruling. But I'll tell you this, what I've seen so far doesn't look good for your HOA. Bang! The gavel fell. And just like that, the man who tried to ruin my life was standing in silence. As his empire began to crumble, I walked out that night into the cold autumn air, a strange calm settling over me. We weren't done, not yet. But for the first time, it felt like justice was catching up. I looked up at the stars, the same sky my father once worked beneath, and whispered, "We're almost there, Dad, 'cause next week, the truth would finally come out. And the people who'd tried to take everything would lose everything instead." The morning of the final hearing, I woke before sunrise. The sky was still dark, heavy with clouds, and a soft fog clung to the fields like a memory that refused to fade. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and stood by the old oak tree near the fence line, the same one my father had carved our initials into when I was 10. The land was quiet, peaceful, and yet, beneath that silence, I could feel the storm brewing, not in the sky, but in that courtroom we were headed to, because today, the truth would finally come out. And when it did, the HOA would never be the same again. Dana joined me on the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. "You ready?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Been ready since the night they pulled up my driveway." She smiled a small, proud smile and slipped her hand into mine. "We're going to win this. I know it." And deep down, I did too. Not because of pride, but because truth doesn't lose. It might get buried, twisted, mocked, but it doesn't disappear. When we arrived at the courthouse, the parking lot was already packed. Neighbors, reporters, even a few county officials who'd caught wind of the scandal. For months, Bradley's HOA had been feared. They'd intimidated, fined, and bullied anyone who questioned them. But now, they were the ones under the microscope, and everyone wanted to see how far the rot went. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Karen sat in the back row, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. No phone, no smugness, just guilt etched into every line on her face. Bradley, though, he still tried to look in control. Pressed suit, cold stare, but his hands were shaking because he knew what Tom had. And today there'd be no hiding behind bylaws or bluster. The judge entered. "All rise." We stood, then sat, and the room fell silent. "Case number 3021, the clerk announced. Lawson versus Maple Ridge HOA. TomRose.com as ever. Your Honor, before we begin, the defense would like to introduce new evidence into record, including testimony from a county zoning officer and financial reports obtained during discovery. Please?" Lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Objection, Your Honor." These weren't. The judge waved him off. They were filed within the deadline. "Proceed." Tom nodded, then turned to the gallery. "Your Honor, we call George Miller, County Zoning Inspector." George walked up, took the oath, and sat. Tom approached with a folder in hand. "Mr. Miller, can you confirm whether the HOA of Maple Ridge has legal jurisdiction over the Lawson property?" George adjusted his glasses. "No, sir. According to county zoning maps, the Lawson parcel is designated as agricultural heritage land. Recorded in 1952, well before the HOA's incorporation in 1986, a ripple of murmurs filled the room. Tom continued, "Has the HOA ever been granted an extension of boundary to include that land?" George shook his head. "No record of such an approval. In fact, the last request, filed by President Bradley Cole, was denied in 2019 due to lack of county authorization." Tom smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Miller." He turned to the judge. "So to summarize, my client's land isn't, and never has been, under HOA authority." The judge nodded slowly. "So noted." I glanced at Bradley. His face had gone pale, but Tom wasn't done. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "we've also uncovered financial records showing the HOA collected fees and issued fines against properties outside their jurisdiction. We have emails between Mr. Cole and a developer discussing the sale of those same properties, including my clients, for a commercial expansion project." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tom laid the printed emails on the bench. "These communications prove malicious intent, that Mr. Cole used his position not to enforce community standards, but to pressure homeowners off their land for personal gain." The judge looked furious. "Mr. Cole," he said sharply, "is this true?" Bradley's lawyer jumped up. Objection. Hearsay. Tom raised a hand. Not hearsay, Your Honor. We have metadata and signatures verifying authenticity. The judge studied the papers, then looked directly at Bradley. Mr. Cole, I strongly suggest you speak honestly. You are under oath. Bradley hesitated. His jaw tightened. And then he broke. Yes, he muttered. I was negotiating with a developer, but it was for the good of the community. We needed funds, Tom cut in. By lying to homeowners? By fabricating violations? By forging county signatures? Bradley's head snapped up. That wasn't me. Tom turned slowly toward Karen. Mrs. Jenkins, you worked as the HOA's compliance officer. Would you like to tell the court who filed those fines? Karen looked down, trembling. I did. But Bradley told me to. He said it was legal. He said if we didn't force Mr. Lawson out, we'd lose the deal. The room went silent. All eyes turned to Bradley. He looked cornered, defeated, like a man watching his own empire crumble. The judge leaned back, expression hard. I've seen enough. He turned to me. Mr. Lawson, you've been harassed, falsely accused, and subjected to fraudulent enforcement. This court rules in your favor. He lifted his gavel. All claims by the HOA are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, Mr. Cole, you and your board are hereby found liable for harassment, fraud, and misuse of authority. Damages will be determined after audit, but I suggest you prepare yourselves. Bang, the gavel struck, and just like that. It was over. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just sat there, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the bench. It wasn't victory I felt first, it was relief. A deep, bone-level relief that came from months of sleepless nights and silent prayers. Dana squeezed my hand. We did it, she whispered. I nodded no. We stood our ground. Bradley slumped in his chair, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. Karen quietly left the room, tears streaking her face. And one by one, the neighbors, the same ones he'd once bullied, began to applaud. It started soft, hesitant, then grew louder, stronger, echoing through the courtroom. Not for me, not really, but for what it meant, that justice still mattered, even against the powerful. Outside, reporters swarmed us. Cameras flashed. Mr. Lawson, how does it feel to win? I smiled a tired, honest smile. It's not about winning, I said. It's about standing up. About reminding people your land, your home, your dignity, they're worth fighting for. One reporter asked, "What's next for you?" I looked back toward the courthouse doors, where Bradley was being escorted out, not in cuffs, but in shame. Next, I said. I'm going home. Back to the land that raised me. That night, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, I walked the fence line one last time. The breeze carried the scent of pine and cut hay. The flag, my grandfather's flag, waved proudly from the pole they once tried to tear down. I ran my hand along the rough wood, whispering, "We did it, Dad. They tried to take it, but we held the line." Dana joined me. Resting her head on my shoulder, "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I think your father would have been proud. He would have fought the same fight," I said. "Only louder," she laughed. And for the first time in months, that laughter didn't echo against fear. It soared through peace. A few weeks later, the county ordered a restructuring of the HOA. Bradley resigned in disgrace. Kieran issued a public apology. And the homeowners, those who'd been silenced, started to speak up. They voted for a new board, one that listened, one that served, not ruled. And one of the first motions they passed? A resolution to respect grandfathered properties and protect heritage landowners. It wasn't just my victory. It was ours, sometimes when I sit on that porch at dusk. I think back on it all, the flashing lights that night, the threats, the courtroom battles. And I realize they didn't just come from my land. They came for my peace. But I learned something important, something I carry every day now. When you fight with anger, you burn bridges. But when you fight with truth, You build foundations that last generations. This land, my father's, my grandfather's, it was always more than soil. It was a promise. And promises, like truth, don't break easy. Have you ever stood up against an HOA or someone who thought they could take what's yours? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe in justice, family, and fighting back the right way, hit that subscribe button. And join me for more real justice stories that prove sometimes the little guy wins.